Something shocking appeared on the Aston Martin just before the Chinese Grand Prix, and rival engineers immediately started whispering the same thing. This might be impossible to copy. Not next race. Not next month. Maybe not even this season. Because while most fans were focused on the start of the 2026 championship in Australia, Aston Martin quietly arrived in Shanghai with a set of aerodynamic upgrades that completely changed how the AMR26 behaves. And at first glance, the changes looked small. Almost invisible. But when engineers from other teams began studying the airflow patterns around the car, the conclusion was startling. This was not a normal upgrade. This was a completely new aerodynamic interaction between the floor, the cooling system, and the rear airflow of the car. And the timing could not have been more dramatic. The Chinese Grand Prix is one of the most brutal aerodynamic tests on the entire calendar. A massive back straight where hybrid systems unleash maximum power. A tightening first corner that destroys front tires. And a layout that exposes every weakness in airflow stability and tire management. If a car has a flaw, Shanghai will expose it immediately. But if a team arrives with the right aerodynamic concept, the advantage can be enormous. And that is exactly why engineers across the paddock suddenly began paying very close attention to the Aston Martin garage. Because once the airflow pattern on the AMR26 became clear, one question started spreading through the paddock. Did Aston Martin just reveal a concept the rest of the grid cannot easily replicate? Because if this upgrade works the way the team expects, the AMR26 could suddenly become one of the most stable aerodynamic platforms on the entire grid. And when a car becomes that stable, something very dangerous happens. Its real performance finally appears. So before we break down the hidden aerodynamic system Aston Martin revealed before China, the airflow trick engineers are struggling to understand, and why some teams believe it could take months to replicate. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because the real story behind Aston Martin's Chinese Grand Prix upgrade might be much bigger than anyone expected. Right after the Australian Grand Prix, Aston Martin's engineers returned to the factory with a very clear feeling. The AMR26 had potential. Real potential. But something about the car's aerodynamic behavior was still incomplete. During the Melbourne race weekend, the car showed moments of impressive stability through medium speed corners. Fernando Alonso was able to push the car with confidence during certain stints, and the lap times suggested that Aston Martin might finally be closing the gap to the front of the grid. But when the engineers began analyzing the long-run data, a subtle pattern started to appear. The car was producing strong downforce, yet that downforce was not always arriving in a perfectly controlled way. During some phases of the lap, especially in longer corners, the aerodynamic balance shifted slightly as the car moved through different ride heights. To a casual viewer, that kind of behavior would never be visible. But to a Formula One driver, even the smallest shift in aerodynamic balance changes everything. Because when the airflow under the floor becomes unstable, the downforce changes suddenly. And when the downforce changes suddenly, the driver must react. A small steering correction. A slight lift of the throttle. A tiny adjustment that costs only a fraction of a second. But when those adjustments happen repeatedly over a race distance, the consequences become much bigger. Tire temperatures rise. Traction begins to disappear. And the car slowly moves away from its ideal performance window. That is exactly what Aston Martin engineers believed was happening inside the AMR26. The floor was capable of producing very strong ground effect downforce, but the airflow feeding the Venturi tunnels beneath the car was not perfectly stable during transitions. And in modern Formula One, those transitions happen constantly. Braking compresses the suspension. Acceleration lifts the rear of the car. Cornering shifts the aerodynamic load across the chassis. Every one of those movements changes the angle at which air enters the floor. If that airflow becomes unstable, the downforce fluctuates. And fluctuating downforce creates an unpredictable car. So after Australia, Aston Martin engineers began focusing on the most sensitive aerodynamic surfaces of the entire machine. The floor edges. These narrow structures running along the sides of the floor control how air enters the Venturi tunnels underneath the car. If the airflow arrives clean and stable, the tunnels generate enormous ground effect downforce. But if that airflow becomes turbulent, the tunnels lose efficiency. The solution Aston Martin appears to have introduced before the Chinese Grand Prix focuses on stabilizing that entry airflow. Subtle geometric changes along the floor edge guide the air more precisely toward the tunnels. Small aerodynamic elements manage how the airflow behaves when the car changes ride height during acceleration. And the interaction between the floor and the rear suspension airflow has been refined to keep the aerodynamic platform stable even when the car moves through the most violent phases of the lap. These changes might look small, but inside the world of Formula One engineering, they represent a major step toward aerodynamic consistency. Because once the airflow under the floor remains stable, the entire car begins to behave differently. The downforce becomes smoother. The balance remains predictable. And the driver can begin pushing harder without triggering sudden changes in grip. But as rival engineers continued studying the AMR26 in Shanghai, they began noticing something else. Something that made the upgrade even more intriguing. Because the floor was not the only system Aston Martin had quietly adjusted before the Chinese Grand Prix. But the floor was only one part of the story. Because as engineers in the paddock continued observing the AMR26 in Shanghai, another pattern began to appear. A pattern that connected directly with the floor changes, and made the entire concept far more complex than it first seemed. The cooling system. At first, that might sound strange. Cooling normally has nothing to do with pure aerodynamic performance. But on a modern Formula One car, especially under the 2026 regulations, the cooling system is no longer just a way to manage engine temperatures. It has become an aerodynamic tool. Inside the AMR26, the power unit is packaged extremely tightly. The side pods are narrow, the engine cover is sculpted aggressively, and the cooling outlets are carefully positioned along the rear bodywork. When hot air exits those cooling channels, it does not simply disappear into the atmosphere. It interacts with the airflow traveling toward the rear of the car. And that interaction can change how the air reaches the diffuser and rear wing. In other words, the cooling system becomes part of the aerodynamic structure. This is exactly what rival engineers started to notice when studying the Aston Martin in China. The cooling outlets appeared slightly different compared to the configuration used in Australia. Subtle reshaping. A different direction in how the hot air left the engine cover. Small details that looked insignificant at first. But when those details were combined with the floor changes, a much bigger idea began to emerge. Aston Martin was controlling the airflow not only under the car, but also above it. The floor stabilizes the airflow entering the Venturi tunnels. The cooling outlets shape the airflow feeding the diffuser and rear wing. Together, they create a much more controlled aerodynamic environment around the rear of the car. And that control is incredibly valuable. Because the rear of a Formula One car is where traction is born. When the airflow feeding the diffuser remains stable, the downforce generated at the rear becomes more consistent. And when rear downforce remains consistent, the driver can apply throttle earlier on corner exit. That means better acceleration, better tire management, and stronger race pace. But this is also the reason rival teams believe Aston Martin's concept could be extremely difficult to copy. Because this is not a single aerodynamic part. It is a coordinated interaction between multiple systems. The floor geometry, the cooling airflow, the rear suspension wake, and the active aerodynamic surfaces that change the car's drag profile on long straights. Every one of those elements affects the others. If another team tried to replicate only the floor design, the cooling airflow might disturb the balance. If they copied only the cooling outlet shapes, the airflow underneath the floor might not behave the same way. To recreate the concept, a rival team would need to redesign the entire aerodynamic ecosystem of their car. That takes time. Wind tunnel testing, computational simulations, new components. Which is exactly why some engineers inside the paddock quietly described the Aston Martin upgrade with a very unusual phrase. Not unbeatable, but extremely inconvenient to copy. And in Formula One, inconvenience can be a powerful advantage. Because while rival teams spend weeks or months trying to understand the concept, the team that created it continues developing it even further. For drivers like Fernando Alonso, that kind of aerodynamic stability can unlock something very valuable. Confidence. When a driver trusts the behavior of the car, every lap becomes more aggressive. Braking points move later. Throttle application happens earlier. Corner speeds increase. And tire degradation becomes easier to control. That is why the upgrades revealed before the Chinese Grand Prix may represent more than just a step forward for Aston Martin. They might represent the beginning of a completely new aerodynamic direction for the team. And if the AMR26 continues evolving around this concept, the Chinese Grand Prix might eventually be remembered as the moment when Aston Martin quietly revealed a design philosophy that the rest of the grid suddenly had to start chasing. But the deeper engineers looked into the AMR26 after the Chinese Grand Prix, the more they realized something even more intriguing. These upgrades were not designed only for Shanghai. They were designed for the entire season. Because Shanghai simply exposed the concept early. The Chinese circuit is one of the most brutal aerodynamic tests in Formula One. The opening spiral corner forces the front tires to carry enormous load for several seconds, while the car remains in a constant turning state. Then, only moments later, the car launches onto one of the longest straights in the championship. Full throttle. Maximum hybrid deployment. Minimum drag. That combination forces the car to transition between completely different aerodynamic conditions in just a few seconds. And that is exactly where Aston Martin's concept begins to show its real strength. Most Formula One cars generate downforce very effectively in stable conditions. But the real challenge is maintaining that downforce when the car transitions between braking, turning, and accelerating. If the airflow becomes unstable during those transitions, the balance of the car changes instantly. Drivers feel that change as instability. A nervous rear end. Sudden loss of grip. Tiny corrections that slowly destroy tire performance. But the AMR26 upgrades appear designed to smooth those transitions. The floor keeps the airflow under the car stable. The cooling system guides the airflow toward the rear of the car. And together, those systems create a much more predictable aerodynamic platform. When that happens, something important changes for the driver. The car stops surprising them. And when a Formula One driver stops being surprised by the car, they start attacking the circuit. Fernando Alonso is one of the best drivers in the history of the sport at exploiting exactly that kind of stability.